One moment of rage, one act of vengeance. That's all it took to turn years of buried resentment into the most horrific revenge deaths ever recorded. These aren't random acts of violence. They're calculated acts of retribution where victims became perpetrators, and where the desire for revenge consumed every rational thought until there was no turning back. It was March 15th, 2016, when a heated workplace confrontation in a major Midwest city turned deadly, forever changing the lives of two men whose bitter rivalry had been building for months. Clint Harrison, a 34-year-old warehouse supervisor at a mid-sized industrial supply company, was known throughout the facility for his aggressive management style and cruel tendency to publicly humiliate his workers. Standing at 6 feet tall with a commanding presence, Clint ruled his domain with an iron fist, believing that fear and intimidation were the keys to productivity. Martin Webb, 28, operated forklifts on the day shift and had become Clint's primary target over the past 6 months. Webb was a quiet, hard-working family man whose wife was expecting their second child. Despite his stellar safety record spanning 5 years without incident, Clint had systematically written him up for minor infractions, creating a paper trail designed to justify denying Webb a recent promotion to lead operator. Webb's co-workers had witnessed Clint's campaign of harassment, but none dared speak up for fear of becoming targets themselves. The warehouse culture had become toxic under Clint's leadership, with employees walking on eggshells and productivity suffering despite his intimidation tactics. The tension reached a breaking point that Monday afternoon during shift change. Clint had spent the day berating Webb in front of the entire crew, calling him incompetent and threatening termination over a minor paperwork error. As Webb prepared to clock out, Clint cornered him near the loading dock, away from most witnesses. Clint's voice echoed through the empty loading area as he continued his verbal assault, telling Webb he would never amount to anything and that his family would suffer because of his incompetence. He mocked Webb's financial struggles and suggested that maybe his wife would be better off with a real man. When Webb tried to walk away, Clint grabbed his arm and shoved him backward with unnecessary force. In a moment of rage fueled by months of humiliation, Webb grabbed a 3-pound steel pipe wrench from a nearby maintenance cart. Without thinking, driven by pure instinct and overwhelming anger, he swung it at Clint's head with full force. The wrench struck Clint's left temple with a sickening crack, fracturing his skull and causing immediate brain trauma. Clint collapsed instantly, his body hitting the concrete floor with a dull thud as blood began pooling beneath his head. He convulsed briefly, his eyes rolling back before going completely still. The impact had caused a massive subdural hematoma, and Clint died within 2 minutes from severe brain injury and internal bleeding. Webb stood frozen in shock, the wrench still in his trembling hands as he realized what he had done. 2 other employees working nearby had witnessed the entire confrontation and came running when they heard the impact. One immediately called 911, while the other tried unsuccessfully to provide first aid. Webb was arrested and charged with voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, as prosecutors acknowledged the confrontation was not premeditated. During the trial, testimony revealed Clint's systematic pattern of workplace harassment and the mounting financial pressure Webb faced supporting his growing family. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, citing the tragic circumstances, but noting that violence could never be justified. It was October 14th, 2018, when 3 years of neighborhood harassment reached its deadly conclusion on a quiet Sunday afternoon, as what began as a property dispute between neighbors escalated into unthinkable violence that would shatter 2 families forever. Sarah Mitchell, 34, was a devoted mother of 2 young children who had endured relentless bullying from her next-door neighbor, Tessa Monroe, 41. What started as complaints about Sarah's children playing too loudly had evolved into a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that included false police reports, deliberate property damage, and increasingly threatening behavior towards Sarah's family. Tessa, a bitter divorcee who worked nights as a security guard, seemed to take perverse pleasure in tormenting the Mitchell family. Her own life had fallen apart after a messy divorce that left her financially struggling and emotionally unstable. She had called Child Protective Services multiple times with fabricated abuse allegations, forcing Sarah to endure humiliating investigations that found no evidence of wrongdoing. The harassment escalated when Tessa began targeting the family pets. She had poisoned their beloved golden retriever, Max, with antifreeze, claiming the dog was too noisy when it barked at strangers. The veterinary bills had cost the Mitchells over $3,000, and Max barely survived the poisoning. That Sunday afternoon, Sarah was tending to her vegetable garden while her 6-year-old daughter Emma played on the swing set. The October air was crisp and peaceful, with colorful leaves scattered across the yard. Tessa emerged from her house in a rage, still wearing her security guard uniform from the previous night's shift. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and alcohol consumption. She began screaming at Emma, claiming the child's laughter was disturbing her sleep and threatening to call the police if the noise didn't stop immediately. When Sarah intervened, rushing to protect her daughter, Tessa escalated the confrontation by threatening to make the whole family disappear and claiming she had connections who could take care of problems like them. The threat was delivered with such venom that Sarah genuinely feared for her family's safety. Emma began crying and ran to hide behind her mother, trembling with fear. The argument moved to the front yard where other neighbors began watching from their windows, some recording the confrontation on their phones. Tessa, emboldened by the audience, grabbed Sarah's garden hose and began spraying both Sarah and Emma with freezing water, soaking their clothes and causing Emma to scream in shock and cold. Sarah, overwhelmed by 3 years of torment and seeing her daughter being physically assaulted, pushed Tessa away from them with both hands. The force was not excessive, but Tessa, who had been drinking and was unsteady on her feet, stumbled backward and fell, striking her head on the sharp concrete edge of her driveway with a sickening crack. The impact caused a severe concussion and immediate brain swelling. Tessa lost consciousness instantly and began having violent seizures, her body convulsing uncontrollably as blood seeped from her head wound onto the concrete. Sarah, overwhelmed by 3 years of psychological torture and seeing her traumatized daughter, made a split-second decision that would haunt her forever. Instead of immediately calling 911, she took Emma inside their house and waited 15 crucial minutes before calling emergency services, claiming she had just discovered her neighbor unconscious after an apparent fall. Tessa died from her brain injuries before paramedics could save her. The delayed emergency response proved critical. Medical experts later testified that immediate treatment could have prevented her death, as the brain swelling could have been controlled with rapid intervention. It was November 18, 2017, when the prestigious university dormitory became the scene of a calculated murder, as academic rivalry and social jealousy drove one student to commit what she believed would be the perfect crime. Bryce Chandler, 19, was a pre-med student whose perfect GPA and effortless social success had made him the target of his roommates' growing resentment and obsessive hatred. Bryce came from a wealthy family in California, maintained straight A's without apparent effort, and was dating the most popular girl on campus. Amanda Torres, 20, was a scholarship student from a working-class family who worked 2 part-time jobs to afford basic necessities like food and textbooks. Despite studying constantly, often until 3 a.m. in the library, she struggled to maintain a B average while watching Bryce excel without breaking a sweat. Amanda's financial stress was overwhelming. She survived on ramen noodles and generic coffee while Bryce ordered expensive takeout. The contrast between their lives was stark and painful. While Amanda wore the same 3 outfits repeatedly and walked everywhere to save money, Bryce had a closet full of designer clothes and complained about having to choose between his Mercedes and BMW for weekend trips home. Amanda discovered that Bryce had a severe peanut allergy that he kept secret from most people, fearing it would affect his social life and dating prospects. Bryce carried an EpiPen in his backpack but rarely mentioned his condition, trusting Amanda with this potentially life-threatening secret. Over several weeks, Amanda researched peanut allergies extensively, learning that even trace amounts could trigger severe reactions in highly sensitive individuals. She began tampering with small amounts of peanut residue in his food and personal items, observing how he reacted without drawing attention. Amanda contaminated Bryce's lip balm, face cream, and even his pillowcase with tiny amounts of peanut residue, causing him to develop mysterious rashes and breathing difficulties that he attributed to stress and poor air quality in the dorm. The plan culminated during finals week, when stress levels were at their highest and Bryce was most vulnerable. Amanda prepared Bryce's favorite protein smoothie using a blender she had deliberately contaminated with peanut butter hours earlier, ensuring maximum cross-contamination. Bryce, touched by what seemed like a rare gesture of kindness from his distant roommate, consumed the entire smoothie while reviewing his notes at his desk. Within minutes, he began experiencing the first symptoms. tingling in his mouth and throat, followed by difficulty swallowing. The allergic reaction progressed rapidly. Bryce's face began swelling, his breathing became labored and wheezy, and his blood pressure started dropping dangerously. He recognized the symptoms immediately and searched frantically for his EpiPen, which Amanda had hidden earlier in the day while Bryce was in class. Amanda watched with cold calculation as Bryce collapsed on the floor, gasping for air and begging Amanda to call 911. Bryce's lips were turning blue, and his swollen throat was making breathing nearly impossible. His eyes were wide with terror as he realized what was happening and that his roommate was making no move to help him. Instead of helping, Amanda sat at her desk and continued studying for her own exam, occasionally glancing at Bryce's deteriorating condition with detached interest. She waited until Bryce stopped breathing entirely before calling emergency services, claiming she had just discovered her roommate unconscious. Bryce died from anaphylactic shock, his body shutting down from the severe allergic reaction. The investigation initially treated it as a tragic accident, until Amanda's internet search history revealed extensive research into peanut allergies, cross-contamination methods, and deliberate poisoning techniques. It was December 25, 2018, when Christmas dinner became a scene of horror, as decades of family resentment and financial manipulation exploded into violence that would destroy an entire bloodline and shatter the illusion of a perfect family. Lana Whitfield, 67, was the wealthy matriarch of a prominent family who had spent years manipulating her children through financial control and emotional abuse. Her late husband had built a successful real estate empire worth over $15 million, and Lana had used this wealth as a weapon to control every aspect of her children's lives. David Whitmore, 42, was Lana's youngest son who had sacrificed his promising career as an architect to serve as her primary caregiver for the past 5 years. He had moved into her mansion, given up his own apartment, and dedicated his life to managing her medical appointments, medications, and daily needs. Despite his devotion, Lana constantly criticized him and threatened to remove him from her will entirely whenever he showed any sign of independence. Lana's manipulation was psychological and systematic. She would promise David inheritance money to keep him dependent, then threaten to disinherit him whenever he considered dating or pursuing his own interests. The family had gathered for their traditional Christmas dinner at Lana's sprawling estate, a ritual that had become increasingly tense over the years. The dining room was elegantly decorated with expensive china and crystal, creating an atmosphere of wealth and tradition that masked the underlying dysfunction. During the meal, Lana announced she was changing her will again, this time leaving everything to a cancer research charity and disinheriting all her children completely. She claimed they were all ungrateful parasites who didn't deserve her wealth, and that she wanted to leave a meaningful legacy rather than support their lazy lifestyles. David, who had given up everything to care for his mother and had no savings or career prospects at age 42, felt his world collapsing. The other siblings had their own careers and families, but David had nothing except his role as caregiver. The argument that followed was explosive, with years of suppressed resentment finally erupting. Lana began listing David's failures and inadequacies in front of the entire family, calling him a disappointment and claiming he had never accomplished anything worthwhile. She mocked his abandoned architectural career and suggested he was too weak and pathetic to survive on his own. When David tried to defend himself, explaining the sacrifices he had made for her care, Lana slapped him hard across the face in front of his nieces and nephews. The slap was not just physical but symbolic, a final rejection of everything he had given up for her. In a moment of pure rage and desperation, David grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the dining room table, an expensive piece that had been in the family for generations. He struck his mother across the head with tremendous force, the crystal shattering on impact and causing severe head trauma. Lana collapsed onto the dining room floor and never regained consciousness. Blood was pooling beneath her gray hair and mixing with the scattered crystal fragments. The elegant Christmas dinner had become a crime scene, with children screaming and adults frozen in shock. David's siblings immediately called 911, and paramedics arrived within minutes. Despite resuscitation attempts, Lana was unresponsive, and her injuries were later determined to be fatal. It was September 22nd, 2016, when 20 years of buried shame and resentment came to a deadly climax at a high school reunion, as past bullying finally caught up with its perpetrator in the most tragic way possible. Lisa Park, 38, had been the victim of relentless bullying throughout high school, particularly from popular student council president Gavin Pierce and his circle of friends. The harassment had been systematic and cruel, involving public humiliation, social isolation, and psychological torture that had left lasting scars on Lisa's psyche. Gavin, now 38 and a successful marketing executive for a major advertising firm, had never acknowledged or apologized for his role in Lisa's trauma. He had built a successful career on his charisma and social skills, the same qualities that had made him a powerful bully in high school. Lisa had spent 2 decades building a successful career as a forensic accountant, using her analytical skills and attention to detail to uncover financial fraud for major corporations. Despite her professional success, she had struggled with relationships and self-esteem issues that traced directly back to her high school trauma. The reunion was held at an upscale lakeside resort, where many classmates were staying overnight, creating an atmosphere of nostalgia and celebration. Lisa had decided to attend specifically to confront Gavin about the past, hoping for some acknowledgement or apology that might help her find closure. When she finally approached Gavin during the evening social hour, he was surrounded by the same group of friends who had participated in the bullying 20 years earlier. Lisa attempted to have a private conversation with Gavin about how the bullying had affected her life, explaining the suicide attempt, the therapy, and the ongoing struggles with self-worth and relationships. Gavin's response was devastating. He dismissed Lisa's concerns with the same cruelty he had shown in high school, claiming Lisa was being overly dramatic and needed to get over it after all these years. The confrontation moved to the resort's lakeside dock, when Gavin suggested they continue their conversation away from the crowd. The wooden dock stretched over water nearly 12 feet deep, where the lake bed dropped off sharply from the shore. A few aging lamps cast faint reflections across the dark surface as Gavin continued his verbal assault, telling Lisa she was still the same pathetic loser she had been in high school. When Lisa began crying, overwhelmed by the realization that Gavin had learned nothing and felt no remorse, Gavin pushed her and threatened to throw her in the lake like old times, referencing a particularly traumatic incident from their senior year. Lisa, overwhelmed by decades of suppressed rage and fresh humiliation, grabbed Gavin's arm as he shoved her. In the struggle, Gavin lost his balance on the slick boards, pulling Lisa with him. As they both plunged into the cold, dark water, Gavin, who had been drinking heavily throughout the evening and was wearing an expensive suit, immediately began struggling to stay afloat in the frigid water. Lisa, who had become a strong swimmer as part of her therapy and self-improvement efforts, could have easily helped Gavin reach the safety of the dock or shore. Instead, she treaded water and watched as Gavin panicked, his alcohol-impaired coordination making it difficult for him to swim effectively. Gavin's struggles became increasingly desperate as the cold water sapped his strength and his heavy clothing dragged him down. He called out for help, his voice echoing across the lake, but Lisa remained motionless in the water, watching her former tormentor fight for his life. Lisa swam to shore and climbed out, claiming Gavin had fallen in accidentally while they were talking near the dock. Several reunion guests nearby heard the argument growing louder, and then a sudden splash, though the darkness made it hard to see what actually happened on the lake. The investigation revealed Lisa's motive and her deliberate failure to rescue Gavin despite being an excellent swimmer and having multiple opportunities to save him. It was January 15th, 2020, when Rebecca Lawson's prestigious medical career came to a devastating end, as her history of negligence and arrogance finally caught up with her in the most personal and tragic way possible. Rebecca, 52, was a renowned cardiac surgeon whose exceptional technical skills were overshadowed by her arrogance, substance abuse, and willingness to cut corners when it suited her schedule or financial interests. Nurse Nora Martinez, 29, had worked under Rebecca for 3 years in the cardiac surgery unit and had witnessed multiple instances of negligence, patient abuse, and dangerous shortcuts that put lives at risk. Martinez had filed numerous complaints with hospital administration, documenting instances where Rebecca had operated while intoxicated, falsified medical records, and blamed complications on other staff members to avoid responsibility. However, Rebecca's reputation as a skilled surgeon and her ability to generate revenue for the hospital made her virtually untouchable. The breaking point came when Rebecca's negligence during a routine cardiac procedure resulted in the death of Martinez's 8-year-old nephew, Miguel, who had been born with a correctable heart defect. Martinez discovered that Rebecca had been drinking heavily before Miguel's surgery, consuming alcohol in her office during her lunch break before entering the operating room. During the procedure, Rebecca made critical errors that directly caused Miguel's death. She punctured the child's aorta while attempting to repair the septal defect, causing massive internal bleeding that could not be controlled. Miguel died on the operating table after nearly an hour of uncontrolled bleeding, while Rebecca and the team struggled to stabilize him, not out of duty, but to avoid the consequences of her negligence. After Miguel's death, Rebecca falsified medical records to make it appear that the child had died from unexpected complications rather than a surgical error. When Martinez attempted to report the truth to authorities, Rebecca used her influence to have Martinez fired and blacklisted from other hospitals in the region. Martinez's sister was devastated by Miguel's death and never recovered from the loss of her only child. Martinez spent months planning her revenge, using her medical knowledge and access to hospital supplies to devise what she believed would be an untraceable method of murder. She obtained a job at a private surgical clinic, where Rebecca occasionally performed procedures for wealthy patients. The opportunity came on a day when Rebecca arrived at the clinic suffering from severe food poisoning. Despite her obvious illness, nausea, vomiting, and dehydration, she refused to cancel her scheduled surgery on a wealthy businessman, driven by her pride and the substantial fee involved. Standard medical protocol required her to stay off duty to protect both her health and that of her patients, but she insisted on receiving IV fluids and medication to stabilize herself before operating. As Rebecca lay in the treatment room, hooked to an IV and basic monitors, she was groggy from the anti-nausea medication, but still responsive. When the other nurse stepped out briefly, Martinez took her chance. She slipped a syringe into the IV port and slowly injected potassium chloride, a substance that, in high doses, stops the heart by disrupting its electrical rhythm. The clinic stocked potassium chloride for routine post-operative care in pre-mixed IV solutions. Martinez, familiar with the supply system, had quietly drawn several doses into a syringe earlier that day. The drug was kept in a locked cabinet, but staff access was loosely monitored, a common gap in smaller private facilities. Within about a minute, Rebecca's monitors erupted as her heartbeat faltered and then flatlined. To the team rushing back in, the collapse appeared to be a sudden complication from her illness. Despite repeated defibrillation and cardiac medications, she could not be revived. Clinic security reviewed footage of Martinez's activities during Rebecca's treatment, and toxicology later confirmed abnormally high potassium levels inconsistent with her medical condition. Martinez was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During her trial, she showed no remorse for Rebecca's death, stating that she had prevented the surgeon from killing more innocent patients and that justice had finally been served for Miguel and all of Rebecca's other victims. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now.